Right, on to today's main subject then. We are heading to the Championship, and it was a massive game on Saturday as Swansea faced Cardiff. Big Mick was the winner. He's really, really transformed Cardiff, but it's a blow to Swansea's promotion hopes. And the man at the helm, Steve Cooper, who actually, Mike, we've talked about in Any Other Business a few times, haven't we, with his various comments down the years. He's a man who didn't have much of a notable playing career and is sort of well versed in youth football, I guess. But he's very much of, and this is something that you mentioned actually to me. He's very much a product of St George's Park, isn't he? A student of the game, and he's kind of almost one of these new managers who's come through the various academies and likes to set out in a certain way.
Yeah, his playing career was kind of mostly in the League of Wales. He started out at Wrexham, but then played in the League of Wales for all of his playing career, while coaching at the same time as his playing career at Wrexham as a youth coach. Then he ended up at Liverpool. And then basically when St George's Park was built, he was brought into the England setup. And it's kind of, just become this product of St George's Park. And, he's basically, the FA have built this new infrastructure. And now we've got a manager that comes out of their schooling kind of thing. And he's kind of one of a kind in that sense, in that this is, when he first came in and got the Swansea job, you're thinking, all right, let's see then whether what they teach in the classrooms at St George's Park, let's see if you can translate it to Championship level football. We knew what Cooper did with the England under-17s, winning the World Cup, and what a fantastic achievement that was in those circles. But now, it's a very different world, cutthroat sort of Championship level. So it was always going to be an interesting case study in terms of, just how good is the development set up now with the FA and everything that they've put in place in the past decade or so. And he's been a success, we have to say. Swansea have been top six last season, almost certain to finish top six again this season. He's kind of hit the ground running from the very beginning and never looked back. But also, there's still some questions to answer, and possibly some of the biggest ones are still to come.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in just a moment or two. But what I found very interesting, and Swansea's recruitment policy when it comes to managers is always that little bit different. Of course, they brought Graham Potter over from Sweden before he moved on to Brighton. And I read that there's a recruitment team when it comes to hiring the manager, which includes Leon Britton and Alan Curtis, both Swansea legends, of course. And Alan Curtis had spells in charge of the team. So they sounded Steve Cooper out. He was obviously, on their radar, and they felt he was perfect for the club. Do you think that the main reason why Cooper was hired, apart from obviously his coaching credentials, his ability to connect with younger players? And I guess if you're thinking from a boardroom level, you're thinking, well, we're going to have to cut our cloth accordingly this season, and we need someone who has those connections, who has those ins with other youth academy managers or at top level Premier League clubs, particularly Liverpool, in which he can get those youngsters in and he can make them better and have us flying in the Championship.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. They've never been afraid to go left field and first-time appointments. And I think there's a lot to be said in the Championship for first-time appointments because, there's a lot of shrewd minds in there. But once you've managed at the level a few times, managers begin to second-guess each other and know what they're all about. And this is the problem that some of these Championship managers have. And, why we're talking about potentially some of them having to drop down to League One to build again. So being a first-time manager is sometimes a help for a club to bring in a first-time manager if you're on you're onto a good thing. And with Cooper, I think it's definitely been an advantage for Swansea. I don't think they'd have been in any position to compete on a budget level if they weren't able to attract the type of quality that Cooper has been able to attract from, his previous work with some of these brilliant youngsters that have come through the England setup. So I think that was probably a major part of their thinking. And I think it's been a big leg up for Cooper to be able to attract that kind of quality. But I also think as well, he's very much of the modern mindset. He's very much in tune with the modern player. And, I just think I can't imagine his two, you look at the way that Phil Foden, for example, greeted him when Swansea played Manchester City in the FA Cup. There's a lot of strong sentiment from these young players towards Steve Cooper and the way that he manages and the way that, they're allowed to operate. There's something, I think, a taste of the elite about him that young players, want to be made to feel elite in the way that they're developing their careers. And I think Cooper's a manager that gives them everything they need in terms of support and, the kind of things they need from week to week.
Yeah, and it's interesting his setup as well, because he has described in the past sort of how he wants to go about his business. This was just before he was appointed as the Swansea manager. He says he wants to play attractive football with a clear identity, but also organisation and structure. Now, in my head, Mike, and you've got to bear in mind that my head is a very simple head, they sort of almost clash a little bit, but it's really worked for him, hasn't it, at Swansea? It's playing a decent level of football, and albeit at times they haven't been helped by the pitch at the Liberty, but away from home, certainly they've played a nicer brand of football. But also this season, Swansea have become tougher, haven't they? They've been much harder to beat, and they've sort of played the game a little bit, especially with some late penalties.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's been fascinating this season how they've evolved from last season, because last season I thought they were maybe a bit too much processed to be considered the real deal for promotion. And what's impressed me most about them this season is that they've added that a bit more steeliness to themselves. They're going away and grinding out 1-0s and doing it in such a way that, they're making sure in some games that not an awful lot of football is being played, as in, they might enjoy plenty of possession and they might, be doing, be easy on the eye, so to speak, and might be fulfilling what Cooper calls a team with an identity and based around possession football. But they're basically making sure that most of the action's being played in the middle third once they've got their lead, and that teams aren't, getting into their final third too often in the game. And they've just been able to close out games very well for much of the season. Now, we're seeing them become a little bit more stretched in recent weeks, and the lead, like you say, they're leaving it very late. They're relying on some, debatable penalties and things like that to get over the line in recent matches. But it's definitely been, I think he is combining, you talk about it, they seem to conflict, the two things that he's saying, but I think he's combining it right. This season we're seeing it. They are still a process team, but there's that bit of an edge to them to grind out results and do it in dirty, ugly ways sometimes. Ugly ways while still being a possession-based team. So I think, although it sounds contradictory, he's actually managing to do both things.
Do we have any idea then how that's come about? Because obviously the pitch, has forced them at times, and it was only for a short period, but it has forced them at times to play in that way. But is this a case of Cooper sort of now with a year under his belt, in the Championship, evolving his style, looking at the Championship and saying, well, this is what we need to do? He's learning from that defeat to Brentford last season in the playoffs. Is this kind of him sort of learning on the job and constantly, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for, sort of reanalyzing and sort of taking stock of where he is at now with this Swansea team and saying, right, this is the direction we need to go?
Yeah, I think his approach is very incremental. I think he never tries to run before he can walk. So this wouldn't have necessarily come about last season because he might have been out of his comfort zone a little bit. First season, and he never tries to implement change too quickly. But I think he kind of sees a season, a whole season as a body of work. Then he'll go away and reflect in the summer, and that's when he's liable to feed in new changes. So I think we'll see, a team that evolves from season to season in that regard. And I think that's very much his style is to be incremental, is not to do too much too soon. We're now last season. They never really had to deal with any pressure last season because he snuck into the top six almost unexpected. I think the lockdown conditions suited them with no crowds, and I think that can still be the same now. I think we saw for much of last season that with a packed Liberty Stadium, I think Swansea felt the pressure a bit more than we've seen since lockdown and since we've come back to empty stadiums. I think we've seen a much better Swansea side, but not in a way that we should expect a regression when fans come back. I think he's been able to develop in a way, probably in an accelerated way that would have been a lot tougher for him with the pressure of the fans and his position being questioned on phone-ins and things like that. I think it's very much incremental, but they've possibly come ahead further than anyone would have anticipated. For a first-time manager of his personality type and the way he likes to go about his business, I think he's ahead of schedule in his career, of possibly where he might have imagined himself. I don't think there's any shortage of belief in his methods and what he wants to do. But I think, hand on heart, if you'd have asked him, would you have had 2 top 6 finishes going for automatic promotion in your second season? He'd have possibly been like, well, I don't know, that might be a bit too much too soon. But that's where they find themselves. So, yeah.
So he helps Swansea in the fact that he has his connections, as we spoke about a couple of questions back. Does Swansea help him then? Is this sort of the right fit? Has he been helped by the fact that he has been given a kind of a very loose blueprint to bring in the players that he wants from various youth academies? Whereas I am not sure how he would cope if he was parachuted in at a club with a dressing room full of egos, for example. I'm thinking here, a man that we've mentioned before, if he had to deal with someone like Troy Deeney on a weekly basis, is it very much just a perfect fit then, Swansea, for Steve Cooper and how he wants to go about his business?
Yeah, I think it's a very good fit. And I think there's been some clues, in fact. I think to have a manager that understands the area, to bring a Welshman in that has access to some of the best English talent. And you see sometimes the way he deals with the media, the local media in Wales, he very much understands the media bubble that surrounds the 2 South Wales clubs. And when they try to big up Welsh players ahead of Welsh internationals, for example, in the group, he's very quick to jump on those questions and not single out individuals, and especially Welsh individuals that perhaps alienate the English players in the squad or make them feel less appreciated. I mean, he's a manager that doesn't like to single out individuals anyway. He's very much about the group collective and everyone mucking in. So I think it's a good fit. I think it's a very good fit because, like you say, I don't think any sort of individuality, and Troy Deeney being a prime example of, his first concern is himself and where he fits into things. Any players like that would be a lot more for Cooper to cope with. Whereas the conditions that he's been allowed to manage in at Swansea, and I think the only real player that he has to deal with is Andrew Ayew, and he's managed him very, very well. I wouldn't say he ever puts him on a pedestal, but there's that respect there because he's willing as a senior pro to work alongside the younger players. There's obviously they're on the same page with the way that Ayew's role's supposed to be behind the scenes, and there's other players as well. But I think the fact that he's allowed to bring in so many younger players who see the game the way he's been sort of brought through as a coach to coach it, I just think, it's all kind of in sync. But I don't think Cooper would necessarily walk into many other championship jobs and be doing the same job that he's able to do at Swansea.
We've spoken before about managers on this podcast who are very much result focused and who, can see the end goal and what they want in their head. And I just found an interesting quote earlier, actually, from Steve Cooper, who's talking about the fact he was influenced by Barcelona B manager Pep Segura. And he said, from a coaching point of view, he's been the biggest influence on me. He showed me the way, a different way. The biggest message that he taught me was that you need to know what your team will look like at the end. You need to close your eyes and imagine what will happen. I just found that quite interesting. Does that make him also results focused then? Or is that something that he is, I guess, bringing to, sort of working on as a result of his meeting with Pep?
I think he's a manager that will always try to find a balance, but first and foremost, they'll be about process and about performance. And a big part of his process is handing ownership over to the players in terms of how you set up from week to week and the type of football that you play. I'm sure there's plenty of non-negotiables, and ultimately it's Cooper that gets the final say. But I think a big part of his, we talk about coaching manuals and curriculums, or these things that managers develop about their identity as a manager. And a big part of Cooper's identity is handing some degree of ownership over to the players, making them feel as though they have a say in what eventually goes out onto the pitch, but within the boundaries of what his philosophy is. And I'm sure he does have the final say. But I think he is mostly performance-based, but he's always trying to strike that balance. Results are becoming increasingly important in the way he goes about it.
Results increasingly important at this stage of the season. So there's expectation now on him. It wasn't there last season. You said the best way to get into the playoffs is to have that run at the end of the season. And I can't help but reference it, Mike, but it's what Blackpool did back in 2010. Swansea did that last year, but then, of course, fell against Brentford. This year, though, they're in there. They're right in the mix. And it's a very different kind of atmosphere now, isn't it? And this is probably the first time that Cooper's got to deal with this. So how do you see him coping over the next few weeks and months?
Yeah, my suspicion right now is that Swansea won't get automatic. I mean, I suppose that's easy to say now. Watford have opened up a bit of a gap this weekend. But yeah, I do believe, I think some of the inexperience is beginning to show a little bit now. And I think in this respect, I reference, we talk about players being given ownership of the process in terms of the way the team's set up and things like that. Another thing that's become apparent in recent weeks, they scored a lot of late goals, important late goals, and even going back to the beat Nottingham Forest 1-0. They were second best in the game, but got a late winner. And then it was referenced in the post-match press conference that the players could be heard in the dressing room going wild, celebrating, And we're in the middle of a schedule now where it's Saturday, Tuesday, or mostly in Swansea's case, Saturday, Wednesday. As Cooper's pointed out, he's something he's a bit sensitive about. But the players are perhaps over-celebrating too often. I think to go on this emotional roller coaster from week to week, after that Nottingham Forest game, wild celebrations post-match in the dressing room. Then they got walloped 4-1 by Huddersfield in the next game. There was another instance where, last-minute penalty, a below par performance against Middlesbrough in the next game where they needed a late penalty to win that one. And, it's kind of these cumulative effects that I don't think it's a coincidence that they lost this South Wales derby this weekend and that they possibly, Steve Cooper's talking about how much they welcome in the international break because it's been such a grueling period for them. I think the emotional roller coaster they've been on a little bit has taken its toll. And I think they do need this international break because I think experience would tell you that when you've still got 10, 12 games in the season to go, to be wildly celebrating last-minute winners and dancing and cheering and jumping about in the changing room when you've got another game in 3 days, I think that expending that kind of emotional energy is not necessarily, I think more experienced managers would get heavily guard against that. And I think these are just little clues that are beginning to creep in. But Cooper himself has said in his last couple of press conferences, this is new for me. I've not been in this position before. I've been in World Cup scenarios, but this is different. It's like, it's every few days. You're not all together in a tournament. Maybe he's brought some of that tournament mentality, of youth players and maybe at youth level, these kind of behaviours and, it's all team bonding because you're away from home, the other side of the world or whatever. And maybe these kind of things are important. But in this context, I'm not necessarily sure that you should be going overboard about your victories. You should be trying to keep things on an even keel for the running. And I think that's possibly going to, I think that might play a part in why Swansea don't get automatic come the end of the season.
Yeah, I suppose as well, if, in the tournament, every game is a big one, isn't it? Every victory is so vital. And they do love a celebration last season. I can remember when they reached the playoffs, Steve Cooper was being tossed in the air by his players. I remember those seeing those scenes. And yeah, they maybe they are going too early here. Just one more question on Steve Cooper that I wanted to ask, and it relates to that Middlesbrough game that you just mentioned there, in which he reacted to Neil Warnock's post-match comments. Now, I always thought, especially during his first season, that Steve Cooper was the sort of manager who would concentrate on his own team, would concentrate on what he was doing first and foremost, and rarely got involved with other managers or reacting to what other managers have been saying. This season, I've noticed it creeping in a lot more. The Neil Warnock example being the most high profile, of course, but he is just starting to get a little bit snippy in reply to what other managers have said, particularly about Swansea's last-minute goals and the way they go about things and whether they deserve the win or not. Is that a sign of pressure, do you think?
Yes, possibly, because I think his template is very much to not get involved. I think that's, we talk about your identity and what you're all about and your philosophy as a manager. And I think this will come into it for Cooper, the way he conducts himself. I think last season was a model of, restraint in terms of not getting involved in anything. Very diplomatic in the way he went about, very sort of, just diplomatic is probably the best way to explain it. This season, he's saying the same things. along the lines of, it's not my place to say. I only focus on my team as a caveat, but then going in and saying, about acting with class. And, it's like, well, you're saying you're not going to get involved, but then you are getting involved. So I think a little bit, he's beginning to feel the emotions a little bit more himself, I think, and being dragged into it more and more increasingly, which is understandable, totally understandable. And I think he will be better for this season as well, because I think he is the sort of manager that will learn from season to season. And maybe some of his biggest lessons from this season are the ones that are playing out right now, this recent stretch of games, how they finished the season. I mean, we talk about the celebrations as well. It was one more interesting point about this weekend in the Cardiff game was that Mick McCarthy wasn't in charge of Cardiff when Swansea won at Cardiff, but got the needle with how much Swansea celebrated at Cardiff when they won. And, the players were obviously very conscious of the over celebrations of the Swansea players on their pitch at full time around Christmas time. When you've got to play a team again a second time in the season, all right, if that's the second derby of the season, there's a whole summer to forget that. But we're only talking 3 months ago, and those Cardiff players have clearly not forgotten. And I think sometimes, there's little things like that come down to experience and the way you conduct yourselves. It's like, and nobody can blame Swansea over celebrating, but you've got to be ready to understand that that's going to motivate the opposition if you're going to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to learn more about how to use the profiling of managers in your betting, so if you've learned about Steve Cooper and you want to use it to back against Swansea in the coming weeks, Mike, there is a very handy case study.
Yeah, I produced a case study on manager profiling because I've been using it since lockdown, basically. It's so much more difficult nowadays to make money betting on football, just playing sort of relative team strength. Data science has kind of got it nailed, and it's so difficult to compete against computers. But if by looking at managers' leadership styles and the way they go about the job, you can kind of find positions within certain matches of what playing to strengths and weaknesses of particular managers, kind of come in at it from the side door and find unique different angles. So it's been very profitable, and I've really enjoyed using it. And I just put together a case study video that you kind of opt in on the link on the description, and you get free access to that video.